Have you signed a contract today? I mean, take a second to really think about it. Because most of us, we imagine thick stacks of paper, formal boardrooms, maybe some fancy fountain pens when we hear the word contract. We just kind of assume it's something that only happens when we're buying a house or starting a brand new job. But what if I told you that you've probably entered into multiple, legally binding agreements before you even sat down for lunch?
Well, guess what? It's true. The simple, everyday action of buying your morning coffee, tapping your transport card on the bus, or even just clicking "I agree" on a random website update, it actually weaves us into this completely invisible web of legally binding relationships. You are navigating contract law every single day, often without even realizing it. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to completely demystify the Malaysian Contracts Act 1950, along with some really foundational case law. And we're going to do it by tracking the fascinating journey of a single agreement, from the exact moment it's created, right up to the moment it officially ends.
Okay, let's just dive straight into our roadmap for today. We're looking at Phase 1, the formation, then Phase 2, the terms, and finally Phase 3, the discharge. All right, let's kick things off right at the beginning with Phase 1, the formation. Literally the birth of a legally binding agreement.
To actually breathe life into a legal promise, we can't just shake hands and hope for the best. The law requires us to gather some very specific, essential ingredients. To form a valid contract, we need 5 absolute necessities: a proposal, an acceptance, consideration, intention to create legal relations, and capacity. If literally any of these are missing, our contract might be dead on arrival. So it all kicks off with step 1, one party making a proposal, or an offer, to another.
Now here is where it gets kinda tricky. There's a massive legal difference between a true offer and what the law calls an invitation to treat. An offer is a rock-solid commitment. If the other person says yes, boom, you are bound. But an invitation to treat, that's merely a preliminary communication to try and induce others to make an offer. For example, think about a price tag on a shirt in a shop window. That is actually not an offer to sell it to you for that price. It's simply an invitation for you to take it to the cashier and offer to buy it. Technically speaking, the shop can absolutely say no.
But hey, offers can also be absolutely wild. Just look at this completely absurd 19th century newspaper ad from the Carbolic Smoke Ball Company. They actually promised to pay £100 to anyone who used their smoke ball and still caught the flu. So when a woman named Mrs. Carlyle caught the flu and asked for her money, the company tried to back out, claiming it wasn't a real offer because, well, you can't make a contract with the entire world. But the court disagreed. This brilliantly illustrates what we call a unilateral offer, proving that a proposal can indeed be made to the general public and accepted simply by performing the requested act.
Right. So once we've got a valid proposal, we need acceptance. And the rule here is incredibly strict. Acceptance has to be absolute and unqualified. Take the 1840 case of Hyde v. Wrench, which involved negotiating the sale of a farm. The owner offered it for £1,000. The buyer replied, how about 950? When the owner said no, the buyer tried to backtrack and accept the original £1,000 offer, but the court said, nope, too late. Making a counter-offer completely destroys and supersedes the original offer. You just can't backtrack.
Oh, and here is another absolute game changer about acceptance. Let's say I offer to buy your car, and I say, hey, if I hear no more from you, I consider the car mine. Can I actually do that? The case of Feldhaus v. Bindley proves you absolutely cannot. In that specific case, an uncle tried to buy a horse from his nephew using those exact words. The court ruled that silence does not amount to acceptance. There's no way you can legally impose obligations on someone just because they failed to respond to you. Acceptance has to be communicated clearly.
Okay, moving on to our third ingredient, consideration. This is basically the value exchanged between the parties, the price paid for the promise. Under Section 26 of the Contracts Act, consideration is generally required. But here's the real shocker. It does not need to be adequate. As established in cases like Fang Sui Kim v. Bei Hawk, if your consent is freely given, you can legally sell an item worth 1,000 ringgit for a mere 10 ringgit. The law only cares that a bargain was made, not whether it was a quote-unquote good bargain.
So that brings us to intention. Because, let's face it, not every single agreement is meant to end up before a judge. The law presumes that informal social and domestic agreements, like a husband promising his wife a monthly allowance while happily married, which we saw in Balfour v. Balfour, are not intended to be legally binding. However, for business and commercial agreements, there is a very strong presumption that parties absolutely do intend to be legally bound. So if a huge company like Esso
promises a free World Cup coin with a petrol purchase, courts will definitely view that as a binding commercial promise.
To finally wrap up this whole formation phase, we've got capacity. Look, even if you have all the other elements perfectly lined up, a contract usually collapses if a party lacks the legal competence to enter into it. Under Malaysian law, this generally means you have to be of the age of majority, which is 18, and of sound mind, meaning you're actually capable of forming a rational judgment at the exact time the contract is made.
But, and let me inject a really surprising and honestly kind of amusing fact right here. While the general rule is that contracts by minors are void, there are exceptions. Minors actually can be legally bound by contracts for necessaries. We're talking things absolutely essential to their reasonable comfort, like food or basic clothes. Though, as the famous Savile Row Taylor case, Nash v. Inman demonstrated, fancy luxury waistcoats bought on credit don't exactly count as necessaries if the minor already has plenty of clothes at home. Also, minors can be bound by contracts for scholarships, insurance, and apprenticeships.
Okay, so we've built it. Let's move to phase 2. The terms. The anatomy of a living, breathing contract. So, we have successfully formed a contract. Now that it's alive, we have to look at its DNA, the terms. These are the actual rules, rights, and duties that are governing this relationship while the contract is functioning. And there are two main types here. Express terms are the promises explicitly stated, clearly spoken out loud or written down in the document itself. But then we have implied terms. These are terms that don't appear anywhere in the text, but they're presumed to exist based on the context of the agreement, common practice, or even statute. It's basically the stuff that just goes without saying in the background. But listen, not all terms are created equal. The really crucial point is understanding the big difference between a condition and a warranty as distinguished in the Sale of Goods Act. A condition is this heart-stopping, absolutely essential term. If you breach a condition, you strike right at the main purpose of the contract, and the innocent party can completely terminate or repudiate the whole deal. A warranty, on the other hand, is a minor, collateral stipulation. Breaching it won't kill the deal. It just gives the innocent party the right to claim financial damages.
So how did these terms actually make it into the contract? Well, they have to be incorporated before or exactly when the agreement is made. Think of the story of Ollie v. Marlborough Court Limited. A hotel guest paid for her room right down at reception. Later, she went up to her room and saw a sign on the wall saying the hotel was not responsible for stolen items. Well, when her items were indeed stolen, the court held the hotel was liable. Why? Because the contract was already fully formed at the reception desk. You cannot legally sneak in brand new terms like that sign after the contract is already made.
Which brings us to our final act. Phase 3, the discharge. How a contract finally comes to an end.
Under the Contracts Act 1950, a contract can basically experience 4 distinct types of death. It can be discharged by performance, by consent, by frustration, or by breach. Let's look at what these actually mean in practice.
Now, the absolute most peaceful ways for a contract to die are through performance and consent. Discharge by performance simply means both parties did exactly what they promised to do. You pay the money, I deliver the goods. Job done. Discharge by consent means that both parties just happily and mutually agree to dissolve the relationship or modify the agreement before the performance is even complete. No drama whatsoever, just mutual agreement.
But, sometimes life just gets in the way. And this brings us to this incredibly fascinating legal concept called frustration. Section 57(2) tells us that if some crazy, unforeseeable event occurs after the contract is made, an event that neither party could possibly prevent, which renders the agreement absolutely impossible to execute, the contract automatically becomes void.
A really classic example of this is the 1863 case of Taylor v. Caldwell. A promoter rented out this grand music hall for a series of concerts. But just before the very first show, the hall accidentally caught fire and burned completely to the ground. The promoter naturally sued for breach of contract. However, the court ruled the contract was discharged by frustration. Because the physical subject matter of the contract was entirely destroyed by an act of God, performance was literally impossible, and both parties were entirely released from their obligations.
And finally, we have discharge by breach. Think of this as the messy divorce of contracts. Under Section 40, if one party completely refuses to perform their promise or just totally disables themselves from performing it, they have repudiated the agreement. This gives the innocent party the legal right to put an end to the contract and, crucially, to sue for damages to cover all their losses.
So, from those very specific ingredients of formation, to the delicate balance of terms, right through to its final discharge, the life cycle of a contract is happening all around us every single day. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought.
Considering just how binding a simple I agree button can be, what conditions and warranties did you blindly accept in yesterday's digital terms of service update? The next time you click accept, or honestly, even just buy a cup of coffee, you might just look at the whole transaction entirely differently. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.